Dawn crept over the plains like a tired prayer that hadn't decided whether to rise or fade. The world was pale and half-formed, the color of cooled ash, and the air tasted of dust that had drifted all night without a place to settle. Sparrow Ridge's railway stop sat lonely beneath the soft light, just a wooden platform, a leaning sign, and rails stretching toward nowhere like thin strips of forgotten hope. It was the kind of morning a man might ride through without noticing. But Calder Boone noticed everything. His horse, Flint, exhaled clouds of white steam as they slowed near the platform. Calder's boots hit the ground with the heaviness of someone who carried more years inside than the world could count. He wasn't a man made for crowds or for talk. He'd learned long ago that silence was a kinder companion than most people. But he never could ignore suffering, not the kind that clung to a person the way cold clings to bone. And that was when he saw her. A woman standing alone beside the station bench, 3 small children draped over her like weary branches on a storm-beaten tree. One child lay over her shoulder, another against her hip, and a third rested in her arms, too large to be carried comfortably, but too small to be walking this early. Her skirt was dust-gray at the hem, and her boots had split at the sides. Yet she stood there with a kind of trembling determination that looked more like stubborn hope than strength. Calder felt something inside him go still. The widow, though he didn't know her name yet, shifted her weight and winced. Her arms quivered as she tried to adjust the smallest child, a curly-haired boy whose head lolled against her collar. The morning wind tugged at her loose braid, brushing it across her face, but she didn't flinch or free a hand to fix it. Every part of her was focused on simply not dropping her children. Calder watched from the shadow of Flint's saddle. Not intervening. Not yet. He had seen dignity bruised too many times to rush help on a woman already staggering beneath the world's judgment. 2 townsfolk near the general store paused their conversation and eyed her. One muttered something about poor planning, another about drifters. Their voices were not loud, but loud enough that they wanted her to hear, the kind of cruelty people use to feel taller. The widow's shoulders tightened, though she kept her head bowed. Shame, Calder knew, had a way of making a person smaller than hunger ever could. He cleared his throat quietly, more to steady himself than anything. He hadn't meant to be near people today, not after the nights he'd been spending wrestling old ghosts beneath starless skies. But the good Lord or plain misfortune had a way of putting him where he needed to be, not where he liked. The oldest child, a girl of perhaps 6 with prairie-blown curls, clung sleepily to her mother's torn shawl. She stirred as if waking, then sagged again, too exhausted to resist rest. The middle child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 4, buried his face in his mother's side as though afraid the morning might see him and take something from him. Calder's breath tightened. He'd known families like this. He'd watched one crumble, watched helplessly, back when he was a younger man and believed he had more time, more strength, more everything. He stepped closer, boots crunching on gravel. The widow stiffened at the sound. Calder lifted a hand gently, as if approaching a skittish mare. "Ma'am," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear, "your little one's slippin'. Don't want him tumblin' now." The woman jolted, her eyes snapping up. They were a soft, sorrowful hazel, like leaves holding on through the first frost. She adjusted the sleeping toddler quickly, murmuring a breathless "thank you," without meeting his gaze again. Calder nodded, stepping back. He didn't offer more. Not yet. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of coal lingering from the last night train. A loose page of newspaper skittered across the platform and caught against the woman's skirt. She didn't even have a free hand to brush it away. Calder noticed the tremble in her legs. The way she locked her jaw every time her arms nearly gave out. How her children slept through it all, as if their little bodies trusted her more than the world itself. The 2 gossiping townsfolk wandered off, leaving a silence so sharp it felt like a blade. The widow swallowed hard, glanced at the sinking sun behind the hills, and shifted her feet as if preparing to walk. She scanned the distant road, no wagon, no help, no husband coming. Only the long stretch of Sparrow Ridge ahead. She took her first step. Her knees wobbled. The child at her hip slid dangerously to the side. Calder's breath caught, but he held himself still. As much as he wanted to lift the burden right from her arms, he knew that stepping in too soon could wound more than it healed. Dignity was a fragile thing. Sometimes the smallest kindness could feel like a reminder of failure. She took another step. Then another. Every footfall left a faint print in the dust, barely holding form before the wind claimed it. Calder watched her long after she passed the water trough and turned onto the main road. Flint tossed his head impatiently, but Calder didn't move. He simply stood there, hat low against the morning glare, eyes fixed on the figure growing smaller with each slow step. Something in him, something old and tired and half asleep, stirred. A question he couldn't quite name whispered through him, carried by the morning wind. A feeling he hadn't let himself feel in years tugged at the hollow behind his ribs. And though he didn't know her name, her story, or what storms she'd weathered to end up on that lonely platform, Calder Boone found his boots turning toward the same road she walked. Not to interfere, not to claim anything, but because some pains echo deep enough that a man can't help but follow, if only to make sure someone doesn't fall where no one can catch them. Thus began a quiet trail that would change every soul it touched. The road into Sparrow Ridge had never felt longer, though it was barely a mile of packed dirt and old ruts. Morning light pooled over it like thin gold, too soft to warm, too gentle to change anything. Mara Ellison, though Calder still did not know her name, walked that road with the quiet desperation of someone who had long ago stopped believing she had the right to rest. Calder followed at a distance that felt respectful but watchful, near enough should she fall, far enough to not startle her. Flint trailed behind him with uneasy steps, sensing his rider's unrest. Every few paces, Mara shifted her children's weight. The movement cut through Calder like a slow blade. The smallest boy, Bram, though he wouldn't hear his name until later, had grown heavier from sleep. The girl, Junie, rubbed one eye with a small fist, trying not to cry. Aben clung to his mother's skirt with the stubborn grip of a child who feared losing the last safe thing he knew. Calder kept his hat low, eyes on the ground, pretending he wasn't studying every tremble in the widow's arms. He wasn't sure when he began caring. Only that he did. They reached the well at the town's edge just as a few early risers stepped out from storefronts and lean-tos. Women with aprons tied high. Men with coffee mugs. All of them paused to stare. Calder had lived long enough to know the tone behind those looks. There goes someone who didn't plan well. There goes trouble that'll cost us all. There goes a woman alone. Mara lowered her eyes, throat working as she swallowed whatever humiliation rose inside her. She moved toward the well, children clinging to her, and tried to lower the bucket with only one free hand. The rope jerked, nearly slipping from her grasp. Calder stepped forward before he could think. "Let me," he murmured. Mara startled, stepping back as the movement caused Bram to sag dangerously toward the dirt. She clutched him tighter, and Calder's heart clenched. "It's just water," he said, soft as a prayer. "That's all." She hesitated, not from fear of him, but fear of owing him anything. Calder recognized the look. He carried enough debt in his own life to know its shape in others. Finally, she nodded. The bucket sank with a soft splash and came up brimming. Calder set it down for her, careful not to crowd her. She dipped a cracked tin cup into it and gave the children the first sips. Only when they drank did she lift it to her own lips. Calder looked away, giving her the dignity of privacy in her need. But when Bram slid again, too heavy for her shaking arms, he couldn't stay silent. "Ma'am, if you'll permit me—" "No," her voice broke before the word even finished. I can manage." Calder nodded and stepped back, though every muscle in him ached to intervene. A woman from across the road called out, "You best not count on charity, miss. Sparrow Ridge ain't flush with it." Her tone was sharp, not out of cruelty but the kind of brittle fear born from scarcity. Mara flinched. Junie hid her face in her mother's shawl. Calder felt anger rise, slow, low, and dangerous, but he swallowed it. Anger wouldn't help Mara. Anger never helped anyone who was already hurting. Instead, he moved just close enough that his presence might soften the stares around her. The moment Bram's head drooped forward again, Mara's knees weakened. Calder stepped in before she hit the ground. "Ma'am, please." His voice cracked like old wood. "Ain't no judgment here. Just hands that ain't tired yet." Mara stared at him, chest heaving, eyes wet from exhaustion rather than tears. She opened her mouth, maybe to refuse again, maybe to apologize, but her strength faltered. Her grip loosened. And that was all the permission Calder needed. He slid Bram gently into his arms, the child folding against him as naturally as if he'd always been meant to rest there. Bram's cheek pressed into Calder's shirt, warm and trusting. Mara let out a small sound, something between relief and defeat. I can carry the other too, she whispered, ashamed to take more. Calder shook his head. No, ma'am. Let me carry what you can't, even if it's just for a spell. Junie blinked up at him, uncertain, until he crouched and offered his hand. Aben followed slower, wary as a coyote pup, but Calder gave him a soft nod that somehow earned his trust. Soon Calder walked with all three children, Junie perched on his hip, Aben tucked under his arm, Bram asleep against his chest. Their combined weight would have staggered most men, but Calder bore it with a strange tenderness, as though he were carrying something sacred. Mara walked beside him, hands empty for the first time in miles. She kept glancing over, bewildered by the sight of her children resting peacefully in a stranger's arms. He didn't speak. She didn't either. The silence between them warmed, slow as kindling catching its first ember. They reached the center of Sparrow Ridge, where the church shelter stood with its whitewashed walls and stiff, self-righteous posture. People watched from porches and storefronts, some curious, some judgmental, a few softening as they saw how the children clung to Calder. Mara's steps slowed. Fear flickered over her face. "What if they turn us away?" she whispered. Calder adjusted the children, then nodded toward the church door with quiet certainty. "Then we'll find another door. I ain't walking off." Mara stared at him for a long, trembling moment, and something shifted in her expression. The tiniest spark of trust. Weak but real, like the first ember in a long-dead fire. Together, they walked toward the church. Calder carrying the children. Mara walking beside him, for once not alone. And the whole town watched a small, fragile hope take its first breath. The door to Sparrow Ridge's church stood half-closed, the morning sun cutting a thin line of gold across its splintered wood. Calder paused before stepping up the last stair, shifting the weight of the three sleeping children. Their breaths pressed warm against him, Junie's soft whispering dreams, Aben's quiet sniffling, Bram's steady heartbeat. He held them as though he'd been doing it his whole life. Mara walked beside him with her head bowed, hands twisting the fabric of her worn skirt. Her shadow trembled on the church steps. She had known many doors in her life, doors slammed shut, doors barred, doors that judged before opening. This one felt no different. "Maybe I should ask alone," she whispered. "Sometimes, menfolk get a kinder answer." Calder shook his head, voice low and certain. "No, ma'am. We walk in together. That's how it ought to be." She swallowed, lifting her eyes to meet his. Something fragile passed between them, a silent plea, a silent promise. He nudged the door with his boot. Inside, the church was dim, the air smelling of old pew varnish and dry hymnals. A pastor in a stiff black coat stood near the altar, wiping lantern soot from his hands. He blinked at them, startled. "Morning," Calder said. "This woman and her little ones need a place to rest. She's come a long, hard way." The pastor's expression shifted in an instant, softness first, then calculation, then a tightening around the eyes that carried the heavy scent of judgment. "We're full," he said briskly. "Times are lean. Everyone's got troubles." Calder's jaw ticked. "I ain't a skin for a sermon. Just a room. A bench. Anything." The pastor spread his hands with performative sorrow. "I'd help if I could. Truly." Mara stepped forward, voice breaking like thin ice. "Please, sir. My children, they haven't slept in beds for days. I'll work, scrub floors, cook, anything." "I said we are full." The words echoed coldly across the sanctuary. Behind them, a few townsfolk had wandered in, called by the scent of unfolding drama. They whispered, exchanged glances, assessing the worthiness of Mara's desperation. Shame crept over her in silent waves. She backed toward the door, breath trembling, her hands shaking as if trying to gather children she no longer carried. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I didn't mean to impose." Calder felt something in him break. A crack in an old locked place he thought would stay sealed forever. He turned to the pastor, eyes dark as a coming storm. "You got empty rooms." The pastor stiffened. "I told you." Calder's voice dropped lower, steadier, carrying the quiet threat of a man who rarely raised it. "You'll tell this whole town why you turned away a mother with 3 babies in her arms. You'll explain it to the same folks you preach compassion to every Sunday." A thick silence rolled through the church. People shifted uneasily. Someone whispered, "Empty north wing's been unused for months." The pastor's face flushed crimson. "Well, perhaps 1 room. Temporarily," he muttered. Calder exhaled, the tension easing from his shoulders. Mara covered her mouth, a sound escaping her, half relief, half disbelief. The pastor gestured curtly. "Follow me." The room they were given was small, with peeling walls and a single window overlooking the dusty street. But it had blankets, and a stove, and a bed that didn't lean or creak. To Mara Ellison, it might as well have been a palace. Calder laid the children down carefully one by one. Bram curled immediately into sleep. Aben clutched the blanket. Junie whispered, "Mama? Are we safe now?" "Yes, baby," Mara breathed, brushing her daughter's hair. "We're safe." Mara turned then, slowly, as though afraid the moment might shatter, and faced Calder. "You didn't have to speak for us," she whispered. "You didn't owe us anything at all." Calder leaned against the doorframe, thumb hooking into his belt, his eyes softening in the half-light. "Maybe not. But maybe folks like us, we don't get many chances to do something right." He paused, voice cracking just slightly. "I saw you trying to hold your world together alone. Figured I could shoulder a piece of it for a while." Her breath faltered. She stepped closer, just enough that the air between them warmed. "Why?" she asked softly. A fragile word. One she'd feared to ask any man. Calder didn't look away. "Because no one should bear that kind of weight alone. And because—" His voice turned quiet, almost boyish. "Maybe I needed something to carry." Mara's eyes glistened. She reached down and tucked the blanket around Bram, grounding herself, steadying her emotions. Calder cleared his throat, stepping back toward the door. "I'll leave you to rest. I'll be nearby if—" Mara's hand reached out instinctively, catching the edge of his coat. Not a request. Not a plea. Just a gesture. A small, trembling gesture that held an entire ocean of gratitude. "You don't have to walk away tonight," she whispered. "Not if you'd rather stay a little." Calder froze, not out of fear, but because something gentle had touched a part of him long abandoned. He nodded once, slowly, and moved to sit by the window, where lantern light pooled softly around him. He didn't move closer. He didn't take more. He simply stayed. A steady presence in a room that had known too much emptiness. Mara sat on the edge of the bed, watching him with an expression that was not quite trust and not quite hope, but a fragile thread between the two. For the first time in years, the room felt warm. Outside, Sparrow Ridge wind rattled loose shutters. Inside, a quiet future, still uncertain, still trembling, began to take shape. No promises spoken. No claims made. Just 2 tired souls letting their burdens breathe in the same safe space. And sometimes, that is the beginning of love, long before the word is ever spoken. Final reflective life lesson. And if you, wanderer of this tale, ever find yourself walking with burdens too heavy to name, remember this. There is no weakness in needing help, no shame in leaning on another's strength. The world grows softer, kinder, when hands reach out instead of closing into fists. May you find someone who says, in their own quiet way, "You don't have to carry it all alone." And may you believe them.